This is the Modern American Dream Objective 3, Part 1, about migration patterns of people leaving the Rust Belt and also how suburbia has changed in the 21st century. There will be a Part 2 about the Vietnam and contemporary immigration periods, but for right now we're just going to concentrate on the study guide, Leaving the Rust Belt and Suburbia in the 21st century. So if you take a look, this is the Rust Belt right here. Basically, the Rust Belt would be all of the older industries in America. Your steel, your oil, your coal, rubber, glass, things like that. These are all the industries that existed during this time. If you take a look at these different areas here, you can see that this stretch right here is the coal-producing region of the Rust Belt. Here's where you get into the metals, the steel industry, and things like that. And once you get to our general area in Michigan here, you get to the automotive industries and things that go along with that. Of course, Detroit was a major automotive producer, but in Ohio and places like that, you saw rubber companies that became very important, eventually glass companies as well around the Toledo area. Those things were major components in automobiles, so that whole region was known collectively for its automobile production. Now, in the decades following World War II, an average of 30 million people would be changing residences every year. Families were basically geographically splitting. It used to be your whole family lived in one city, but now when your kids grew up and got married, they were moving other places, and people hadn't really seen that before. But there were good reasons to leave the industrial cities of the Rust Belt, primarily because they looked like this. This is a standard Rust Belt town. You see the old houses and on the right side and the old factories on the left. The Rust Belt was called that because these were cities in decay, cities who spent their winters in ice and snow, with factories that had been around since the 1800s. The Sun Belt, the southern United States and the western United States, that was the area where the new computer industries were coming up and the skyscrapers were glassed and mirrored and things like that. So when you take a look at the Rust Belt, a lot of people didn't really consider it a very nice place to stay. And as a result, they're all taking off from the Rust Belt to go to other places, specifically, once again, the Sun Belt. Now, this region down below here in the red is what the Sun Belt is considered to be today. And even if you look at these areas today, you go to cities like Atlanta, or you go to Dallas, or you go to Los Angeles or San Diego, those general areas, Phoenix, Miami down here. Those areas today are the areas where you're going to see the more modern-looking skyscrapers, like I said before, the mirrored skyscrapers with the glass and everything else, and the modern technologies, not the old technologies of industry and rust and factories, but the new technologies of computers, computer chips, electronics, things like that. That's why it's referred to as the Sun Belt, not just because of the weather down there, but also because it's somewhat futuristic. Now, as people went to the Sun Belt, some demographic changes take place that are pretty significant. California becomes the most populous state in the Sun Belt by 1963. They become 20% of the U.S. population at that time. And every president we had from 1964 to 2008 was from a Sun Belt state. The region that got hit the most, though, was the Great Plains. The Great Plains right here, if you look at it, was about 5 times as large as the state of California. But by 2000, this entire region right here had less people in it than the city of Los Angeles. And that, when you take a look at it from that standpoint, it gives you a really good idea of the migration patterns that happened during that time. Now, what about the suburbs? How had they changed by the time you reached the 20th century, or the end of the 20th century? Well, suburbs during that time are continuing to grow, particularly rapidly in the west and the southwest. They're growing in size. They're changing in shape in some cases. This is a whole new pattern. I guess they thought this would make it a little bit more exciting. And they're expanding out to even more rural, interesting areas. This is out west with, you can see the tiled roofs on here and everything like that. Suburbia was not just a concept that was in the east anymore. It was rapidly expanding across the country. By the year 2000, 50% of America had moved to suburbs, which had by that time progressed to being a little bit more ethnically diverse. Take a look here. The houses still, if you go to a standard suburb now, the houses still look somewhat the same. This has a very Levittown feel to it. But nonetheless, the houses were very, very nice. And the concept of the white flight was long forgotten as more and more ethnic groups were moving into the suburbs by the late 20th century, early 21st century. But in the inner cities, the white flight was still being felt in a lot of urban areas. At the end of the century, only 21% of people who lived in the cities were white. The rest of them were all still minority groups, and that's still kind of a lasting legacy of the white flight. For decades after World War II, inner cities are given less, and they're given less attention and resources than suburbs were. And you can kind of see the effects of that. Here's a picture, an air picture from, I don't know what city it is, but this whole process here, these are all apartment buildings, low rent. In most cities, these would be referred to as the projects. And you can see barren fields around them where things have been knocked down but not rebuilt because people don't want to go in there and construct new buildings if they can't charge the rent they want to charge for it. You see a lot of decay in some of the project areas. Here's one in Chicago where the living conditions are really treacherous and really bad. Urban decay became a major factor in the late 1900s and end of the 20th century, again because the resources were going other places. Businesses that used to thrive and prosper were left abandoned and dilapidated. And this, for example, a factory that's only 2 blocks away from a major sports stadium, even today, is not prospering. It's just another sign of decay that has existed in inner cities. As a result of this, a cycle of poverty began in the cities. People who grow up poor and don't have resources have a very hard time getting an education. When they go to school, their schools are underfunded with not the latest in books, technology, things along those lines. Teachers and students are really fighting against a lot. And a lot of times when you come home to poverty, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to stay in school. A lot of times you have to do other things to support the house, maybe even getting involved in violent crime or drugs or whatever the case may be. And when those kinds of things happen, it just kind of feeds itself to more poverty. It's kind of like the inner cities in this country are locked into a situation where they almost can't get out of. But some cities are trying to make things a little bit differently. Downtown areas in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, which used to be some of the worst Rust Belt decaying cities out there, have really done up their downtown areas. And even in smaller towns like this one, they're taking old buildings and refurbishing them and creating waterfront districts and things like that. So people are definitely making an effort, but it's really tough to clean up the image. As for the suburbs themselves, suburbs are still doing very well today. In a lot of cases, extremely well. But suburban culture always wants to protect itself from the violent crime and drugs that exist in some of the inner cities that have taken place in the late 1900s. So they started gating off their communities to keep people out. This is our community, not yours, and that's perfectly respectful of privacy rights and things like that. But it also symbolizes a major division between what's happening in the inner cities in America and what's happening in the suburbs. These gated communities started becoming kind of castles of middle class or upper middle class affluence or wealth or whatever the case may be. Nothing wrong with that. You know, that's part of the American dream as well. But again, it really symbolizes a big change between what's going on in the inner cities and where resources are going from one place to another. But no matter how far away the suburbs tried to get from some of the problems that were happening in the inner cities, a lot of times they could not. And in the early 21st century, some of the influences that have taken place in the inner cities have made their way in terms of crime and things like that. Suburban crime has gone on the rise in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. So no matter how you look at it, despite the shifting demographic patterns and culture and things that have gone on, the inner cities of America are still kind of looming over the suburbs of the modern day. And the question becomes, how do you fix both things and make both things better than they are?